December 5th, 1941, 4:47 in the morning. Lieutenant Alexei Kuznetsov crouched in frozen darkness 15 miles north of Moscow, and the cold was trying to kill him. Not the Germans, not yet. The cold came first, 38 degrees below zero. Cold enough that breath crystallized in the air before it could dissipate. Cold enough that exposed skin died in minutes. Cold enough that the rifles laid across the snow-covered logs in front of him had to be kept under coats, or they wouldn't fire when the moment came. And the moment was coming. Kuznetsov was 24 years old. He'd been 23 when the war started 6 months ago, a junior lieutenant fresh from academy, full of ideology and confidence and certainty about how wars were won. The ideology had died somewhere outside Smolensk. The confidence had frozen in the forest west of Moscow. The certainty had been beaten out of him in 8 weeks of retreat and desperate defense, and watching good men die for every mile of muddy ground. What remained was this: cold exhaustion and the certainty that in 3 minutes he would either attack or die trying. To his left, a soldier he didn't recognize shifted position. White winter camouflage, proper cold weather gear, moving with the efficiency of men who knew how to survive in conditions that killed everyone else. Siberian troops, 100 of them in this sector alone. Maybe 100,000 across the entire Moscow front. Kuznetsov had never seen them before yesterday. The question that had kept him awake all night, huddled in a frozen dugout with 11 men who used to be 40, where did these troops come from? Every intelligence report, every desperate assessment from headquarters, every conversation with exhausted officers said the same thing. No reserves, nothing left. Moscow's defense was whatever they could scrape together from shattered units and factory workers' handed rifles. But here they were, fresh troops, winter equipment, moving into position in the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts materializing from frozen air. The radio operator beside Kuznetsov, a kid from Vladivostok named Yuri, who looked 16 and was probably 19, pressed the headset against his ear and held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. Kuznetsov checked his pistol. The Tokarev was cold enough to burn skin, but it would fire. Probably. He'd kept it inside his coat all night. Around him, his 11 remaining men checked their own weapons. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said in 8 weeks of hell. Sergeant Pavel Denisov, 52 years old, veteran of the Finnish War, the steadiest man Kuznetsov had ever known, caught his eye and nodded once. No words, just acknowledgement. We're still here. We do this. We've done it before. Except they hadn't. Not like this. For 8 weeks they'd been retreating, defending, holding impossible positions, and falling back when the positions became graves. Now they were attacking. Against Germans who hadn't lost a major battle in the entire war. Against an army that had conquered Poland in weeks, and France in months, and had pushed 500 miles into Soviet territory in less than half a year. The Siberian soldier to Kuznetsov's left turned and looked at him, hard eyes and a hard face. No fear there. No doubt. Just the cold calculation of a man who'd spent his life in conditions worse than this. First time attacking, Lieutenant? Kuznetsov nodded. It's easier than defending, the Siberian said. You're moving forward. Doesn't feel like dying. Feels like progress. Does it work? Sometimes you die moving forward instead of backward, but the direction feels better. The radio operator held up one finger. 1 minute. Kuznetsov thought about the last letter he'd written to his mother, 3 weeks ago, before the final German push. He'd told her Moscow would hold. He'd told her the army was strong. He told her he was safe. All 3 statements had been lies. But what else could you write to your mother when the world was ending? But maybe they weren't lies anymore. Maybe Moscow would hold. The Germans had reached Chimki, 12 miles from the Kremlin, close enough to see the golden domes through binoculars, close enough to smell victory, and then they'd stopped. Not because they wanted to, because they couldn't push any further. Exhausted, frozen, extended beyond their supply lines, waiting for reinforcements that weren't coming fast enough. And while they waited, these Siberian ghosts had materialized in the frozen forests. The radio crackled. The operator looked at Kuznetsov and said, "Now." Kuznetsov stood up. So did 11 men who used to be 40. So did 100 Siberian soldiers who moved like wolves in snow. and across 15 miles of frozen forest north of Moscow, across the entire defensive perimeter that had barely held for 8 weeks, 100,000 Soviet soldiers stood up in the pre-dawn darkness and began moving forward. No artillery barrage first. The attack was silent. The Germans were close enough that noise would alert them. Instead, just men moving through snow and darkness, rifles ready, heading toward positions where other men waited in frozen holes, convinced that the worst was over, that tomorrow they'd push into Moscow and the war would be finished. Kuznetsov started walking. His boots crunched on frozen ground. Beside him, Pavel moved with the steady gait of a man conserving energy for when it mattered. The Siberians flowed through the trees like they were part of the landscape, and Kuznetsov thought, 8 weeks ago, I watched Moscow burn. 8 weeks earlier, October 16th, 1941. Dmitry Petrov stood in Makovsky Square and watched his city tear itself apart. He was 46 years old, a mid-level administrator in the city planning office. The kind of functionary who made sure food shipments arrived on schedule and housing allocations were processed, and the 10,000 small details that kept Moscow functioning actually function. He'd spent 20 years in government service, 20 years of paperwork in committees and careful navigation of political currents, 20 years of keeping his head down and doing his job and believing that competence and loyalty would be enough. All of that meant nothing now. The woman in the wool coat was maybe 30, dark hair, good clothes, the kind of person who, 3 months ago, would have walked past a bakery without thinking twice about whether bread would be available. Now she was holding a brick in both hands, standing 10 feet from the bakery window, and Petrov could see the exact moment she decided that civilization had ended. She threw the brick. The window shattered, glass exploded inward, and before the pieces hit the ground, 20 people were pushing through the broken window, grabbing whatever they could reach: bread, flour, things that yesterday had prices and today had only value measured in survival. A police officer stood 30 feet away, young, maybe 25, watching, doing nothing. Petrov walked over to him. "You're going to let this happen?" The officer turned. His face was blank, empty. "What's the point? Germans are coming. Everyone knows it. Every man for himself now. The Germans are 60 miles away. 60 miles is nothing. They covered 500 miles in 4 months. You think 60 miles will stop them?" The officer gestured at the looting. "This is just early. Tomorrow it'll be worse. Day after. There won't be a city left to defend." Petrov wanted to argue, wanted to say something about duty and order and the importance of maintaining structure even in crisis. But the words died in his throat because he'd spent the morning watching that structure collapse in real time. The government was evacuating. Not officially, not in any formal announcement, but Petrov worked in the administrative machinery. He saw the trains being loaded, documents, gold reserves, art from museums, the embalmed body of Lenin, removed from the mausoleum and shipped east to Kuibyshev for safekeeping. The symbolism of that alone was devastating. Lenin was the foundation of Soviet power. If Lenin's body wasn't safe in Moscow, nothing was safe in Moscow. Factory equipment was being dismantled and moved to the Urals. Entire industrial complexes loaded onto rail cars and sent 1,000 miles east. The radio had gone silent on instructions from above. No news, no announcements, just silence. And in that silence, every rumor became truth and every fear became certainty. The Germans were coming, maybe days, maybe hours. Everyone important was leaving. Everyone who could leave was leaving, and everyone who couldn't leave was making their own preparations for the end. A grand piano on the corner, being sold by a desperate owner for 100 rubles. Yesterday, that piano would have been worth 5,000. A fur coat going for 50 rubles. Jewelry traded for bread. The entire economic structure of the city collapsing as people converted possessions into anything portable. Anything that might have value in the chaos coming. Petrov had sent his own family away yesterday. His wife, Anna. Their 2 children. They'd left on one of the evacuation trains heading east. Anna had begged him to come. He'd said he couldn't. Someone had to stay and maintain order. Someone had to keep the administrative systems functioning. Now, watching the city dissolve around him, he wondered if he'd made the right choice, or if he'd just made the choice that 20 years of conditioning had programmed him to make. Stay at your post, do your duty, maintain the system, even when the system was burning. He walked away from the looting, heading toward the Kremlin, 2 miles through streets that looked like a city preparing for the apocalypse. People burning documents in oil drums on street corners, the smell of burning paper everywhere, ash falling like black snow. Crowds gathered around anyone who looked like they might have information, desperate for news, for confirmation, for someone to tell them what was happening. But nobody knew what was happening. Or rather, everyone knew, but nobody believed it. The Soviet Union didn't retreat. The Red Army didn't collapse. Moscow was the heart of the revolution. Moscow didn't fall, except it was falling. Petrov had seen the reports that morning. The Western Front was disintegrating. Soviet units surrendering in massive numbers or simply dissolving as soldiers abandoned their positions and fled east. German panzer units racing toward the capital from multiple directions. The outer defensive lines crumbling. Commander of the Western Front, Ivan Kozlov, unable to even provide reliable information about where his own forces were positioned. The system that had been built to maintain control, to prevent exactly this kind of chaos, had created the conditions that made chaos inevitable. Officers too terrified to show initiative. Soldiers too afraid to make decisions. A military structure that punished deviation and rewarded compliance, now collapsing because compliance wasn't enough when the situation demanded adaptation. Petrov reached the Kremlin gates. The guards were still there, still checking identification, still maintaining the appearance of order. He showed his credentials and was waved through. Inside, the atmosphere was different, controlled, quiet. The administrative heart of Soviet power, still functioning, still processing information and issuing orders, even as the city outside descended into panic. But underneath the control, Petrov could feel the fear. People walking faster than normal, conversations in hushed voices, clerks carrying boxes of documents, preparing for evacuation that might come tonight or tomorrow, or might never come if the Germans arrived first. He made his way to his office on the 3rd floor. His desk was exactly as he'd left it 6 hours ago. Papers neatly stacked, reports waiting for review. The ordinary machinery of administration, continuing because no one had officially told it to stop. His assistant, a young woman named Irina, was at her desk. She looked up when he entered. "There's a meeting, 4th floor, State Defense Committee. They're asking for updates on food supplies and winter stockpiles." "When?" "Now. They sent a messenger 20 minutes ago." Petrov grabbed his files and headed for the stairs. The meeting was in a conference room he'd been in a dozen times. Maps on the walls, charts showing production figures and supply lines. 12 people around a long table, all of them looking exhausted and none of them looking confident. The meeting lasted an hour. Petrov presented his reports. Food supplies adequate for 3 months if rationing was enforced. Winter stockpiles of fuel and clothing, sufficient but not abundant. Transportation capacity strained by evacuations, but still functional. The kind of information that would matter if Moscow was going to hold. The kind of information that was meaningless if the city fell in a week. When the meeting ended, Petrov stayed behind. He needed to talk to someone. Anyone who might actually know what was happening. An older official, someone Petrov recognized but didn't know well, approached him. "You sent your family away?" Petrov nodded. "Smart. Most of us have. The ones who can." The man lowered his voice. "Have you heard? Volkov is staying." "What?" "The leader. He's staying in Moscow. Announced it last night to the inner circle. Government evacuates, but he stays." Petrov stared at him. "That's insane. If he stays and the city falls, then he's captured or killed, and Soviet power collapses entirely." Yes, Molotov told him it was suicide, but Volkov was adamant. Says if he leaves, Moscow falls to panic before the Germans arrive. Says the system only holds if the leader stays. Does he really believe that? I don't know, but he's betting everything on it. His life, the capital, the entire structure of Soviet power. All on the gamble that presence and confidence can hold the city together long enough for the military to organize some kind of defense. Petrov walked back to his office in a daze. The leader was staying, despite everything, despite the military situation, despite the obvious risk. Either it was the action of a man with nerves of steel and absolute confidence in ultimate victory, or it was the action of a man who couldn't admit his own failures and would rather die than face the consequences of evacuation. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe it didn't matter what the motivation was if the effect was what mattered. He thought about Anna and the children, somewhere east of Moscow now, in a train car packed with refugees and evacuated officials. Safe, or as safe as anywhere could be in a country at war. He'd made that choice, sent them away. Stayed himself because someone had to maintain the administrative systems. But watching the city burn, watching the looting and the panic and the collapse of everything that had seemed permanent and unshakable just months ago, he wondered, what am I maintaining? What's the point of keeping systems running when the system itself is on the verge of destruction? He didn't have an answer. Just the training of 20 years telling him to stay at his post and do his job and trust that someone, somewhere, knew what they were doing. Except the people who were supposed to know what they were doing had built an army that couldn't defend its own capital. October 10th, 1941, 6 days earlier. The office was cold, not frozen like the forest where men were dying, but cold enough that breath misted in the air. Cold enough that General Mikhail Sokolov kept his coat on as he stood in front of the desk and delivered the assessment that nobody wanted to hear. The Western Front is finished. Moscow is indefensible with current forces. Without immediate reinforcement and drastic action, the capital will fall within 3 weeks. Sergei Volkov sat behind the desk, 62 years old, Georgian accent thick even after decades in Moscow, eyes cold and calculating as he processed information that would break most men. He'd been in this office for years. He'd survived purges and famines and political battles that had destroyed everyone who challenged him. He'd built the Soviet system through ruthlessness and cunning and an absolute unwillingness to show weakness. But the Wehrmacht wasn't a political opponent. Couldn't be purged or outmaneuvered or intimidated. The Germans had 3 million soldiers on Soviet territory. They'd destroyed 3 Soviet armies in massive encirclements. They'd captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. They were now less than 60 miles from Moscow and closing. "Can we hold?" Volkov asked. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, as if discussing routine administrative matters instead of the potential collapse of everything he'd built. Sokolov had been asking himself that question for weeks. He was 45 years old, a career military officer who'd survived the purges by being competent enough to be valuable and blunt enough that nobody could accuse him of playing political games. He didn't know how to lie to power, didn't know how to soften assessments. It had almost gotten him executed a dozen times. It was also why Volkov trusted him when trust was rare. "I don't know," Sokolov said. "The German offensive, Operation Typhoon, is hitting us from multiple directions. We're outnumbered, outgunned. Our commanders are junior officers promoted beyond their competence because their predecessors were executed. The men are exhausted. Morale is catastrophic. Equipment is inadequate. Winter is coming, but we're not prepared. The Germans expected to win before winter. We expected to hold before winter. Both assumptions are failing." That's not an answer to my question. I don't have an answer to your question. I can tell you what we need. Every reserve, every unit we can pull from other fronts. Time to organize a defense. Competent commanders given authority to make decisions without fear of execution if those decisions fail. Civilians mobilized for defense works. And luck. Enormous amounts of luck. Volkov leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked in the cold. "If I leave Moscow, what happens? The city falls within days, not to German tanks, to panic. The system holds together because people believe it's permanent and inevitable. If you leave, that belief collapses. Military units dissolve. Civilians riot or flee. The Germans walk into an empty city or a chaotic mass surrender. And if I stay, then maybe the system holds long enough for me to organize a defense that has a chance of working. But if the defense fails, you die or get captured. Either way, Soviet power collapses. So I can leave and guarantee defeat through panic, or stay and risk defeat through military failure." "Yes." Volkov stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Moscow looked normal. People going about their lives, factories operating. The machinery of the state continuing as if the Wehrmacht wasn't racing toward the capital, as if 3 million Soviet soldiers hadn't already been killed or captured, as if everything was fine. I created this situation, Volkov said, not to Sokolov, not to anyone, just stating a fact to the cold air. The purges, late 30s, I eliminated potential traitors. I also eliminated most of the experienced military leadership. 3 of 5 marshals executed, 13 of 15 army commanders, 57 of 85 corps commanders. I eliminated weakness. I also eliminated competence. He turned back to Sokolov. I ignored intelligence warnings about the German invasion, convinced myself Hitler wouldn't attack, signed a non-aggression pact, and believed it meant something. I interfered in military operations, refused to allow retreats that would have saved armies, made tactical decisions I had no business making. Yes, Sokolov said, no point softening it. Volkov knew what he'd done. I built this disaster. Now I have to try to keep it from becoming a complete catastrophe. Volkov walked back to the desk. I'll stay. You'll take command of the Western Front. You'll have authority to make whatever decisions you think necessary. I'll try not to interfere, and we'll see if will and desperation can substitute for competence and preparation. Are you sure? No. But if I leave, we lose for certain. If I stay, we might lose. Might is better than certainly. Sokolov nodded. I'll need 2 weeks, minimum, to assess positions, reorganize units, establish defensive lines. Can you give me 2 weeks? I'll give you whatever time the Germans allow. Make it count. After Sokolov left, Volkov sat alone in the cold office and thought about the choice he just made. Stay in Moscow, risk capture or death. Bet everything on the possibility that visible leadership and projected confidence could hold a system together long enough for military competence to make a difference. It was gambling with millions of lives, with the entire Soviet state, with everything that had been built over 2 decades of brutal consolidation of power. But what was the alternative? Run? Establish a government in exile? Watch Moscow fall and Soviet power crumble, and the Germans push further east until there was nothing left to defend? He'd survived this long by never showing weakness, by projecting absolute confidence in inevitable victory, by making people believe that challenging him was suicide and following him was the only rational choice. Now he had to project that confidence when the Wehrmacht was 60 miles away and every military assessment said the situation was desperate. The strange thing was, he almost believed it himself. Not the certainty of victory, but the certainty that staying was the right choice. That sometimes the symbol mattered more than the substance. That sometimes will could substitute for capability. Or maybe he was just unable to admit failure, unable to face the humiliation of evacuation, unable to accept that the system he'd built was on the verge of destruction. Maybe both. Maybe neither mattered as long as the choice was made. October 15, 1941, evening. The inner circle meeting happened in a conference room 2 floors below Volkov's office. 8 men, the most powerful figures in Soviet government, Foreign Minister Molotov, Secret Police Chief Beria, defense officials, economic planners. The machinery of the state compressed into one room. Volkov announced his decision without preamble. The government will evacuate to Kuibyshev. Foreign embassies will be moved. Critical industrial equipment will be relocated to the Urals. Lenin's body will be sent for safekeeping. I will remain in Moscow. Silence. Complete silence for 15 seconds. Then Molotov, usually the most controlled man in any room, said what everyone was thinking. That's suicide. If Moscow falls, Moscow won't fall if I stay and project confidence. Moscow will fall if I leave, and panic destroys the city before the Germans arrive. You're gambling. I'm gambling that will matters, that systems held together by belief in power require visible manifestation of that power. I leave, the belief collapses. I stay, maybe it holds. Volkov looked around the table. None of you are required to stay. This is my decision. You're free to evacuate with the government. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? Argue with a decision that had clearly already been made? Try to convince a man who'd survived decades of political warfare that he was making a mistake? Beria, the secret police chief, finally broke the silence. If you stay, you'll need order maintained, panic controlled, looters dealt with. Yes, prepare accordingly. That will require brutality. Everything requires brutality. The war requires brutality. Defense of the city requires brutality. The question is never whether brutality is necessary. The question is whether it accomplishes the objective. The meeting continued for another hour. Logistics of evacuation, timeline of government departure, procedures for maintaining communication, the ordinary details of extraordinary decisions. After everyone left, Sokolov stayed behind. He waited until the room was empty except for the two of them, then said, "You're keeping something from me." Volkov looked at him. "Yes. About reinforcements, resources. You told me I'd have what I needed, but you didn't specify what that was." "Intelligence from Tokyo. Richard Sorge, our spy in the Japanese government. He's reporting that Japan will not attack us from the east. High confidence assessment. Which means we can pull divisions from the Siberian border. Fresh troops, winter-trained, equipped for cold combat." Sokolov stared at him. "How many divisions?" "Enough. If Sorge is right, if Japan doesn't attack, if I'm not making another catastrophic misjudgment about enemy intentions." "You're gambling." "I'm gambling on intelligence from one spy that Japan won't attack while we're fighting Germany. If I'm wrong, we lose two fronts instead of one. But if I'm right, you get 100,000 fresh troops to use for counteroffensive when the Germans are exhausted. When do I get them? When I'm certain. When the risk of moving them is justified by the certainty of intelligence. Trust me." Sokolov laughed. Actually laughed. "You're asking me to trust you, after admitting you made catastrophic misjudgments, after acknowledging you created the disaster we're trying to survive, after telling me you're gambling on intelligence that might be wrong. Yes. Why? Because I'm gambling on you too, on your competence, on your honesty, on your willingness to tell me truth instead of what I want to hear. I've spent decades surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear. It almost destroyed us. Maybe already has destroyed us. But if we survive this, it'll be because I finally learned to listen to someone who tells the truth." Sokolov headed for the door, then stopped. "October 10th, you asked if we could hold Moscow. I said I didn't know. Now I'm asking you, are you sure staying is the right choice?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway. Sometimes certainty is a luxury we don't have." October 16th, 1941. Morning. Dmitry Petrov watched the woman throw the brick through the bakery window and understood that the leader's decision to stay might not matter. The city was tearing itself apart. Government evacuation was happening. Everyone could see the trains leaving. Everyone could see the documents being burned. Everyone could see that the people in power were preparing for the worst. And the message that sent was clear. We're abandoning you. Save yourselves if you can. The looting spread through the morning. Shops, warehouses, government supply depots, people taking whatever they could carry, converting possessions to portable wealth, preparing to flee or preparing to survive the occupation that seemed inevitable. Prices collapsed. The grand piano for 100 rubles, the fur coat for 50. Nobody wanted possessions that couldn't be carried. Nobody wanted currency that might be worthless when the Germans arrived. Everyone wanted food, water, fuel, basic survival resources. The NKVD, secret police, started shooting looters in the streets. Not arresting, shooting. Corpses left where they fell as warning to others. The brutality that Beria had promised and Volkov had approved. The terror that held the system together, now applied to civilians who'd broken the social contract by choosing survival over order. Petrov watched an officer shoot a man who was carrying bread from a ransacked bakery. One shot. The man dropped. The bread scattered across the street. Nobody moved to pick it up. The message was clear. Then the officer turned. His subordinate, a younger man, had hesitated, hadn't participated in the shooting, maybe questioning the orders, maybe just too shocked to act. The officer shot him too. One shot. The subordinate dropped beside the looter. Petrov understood. This wasn't about preventing looting. This was about maintaining absolute control through absolute terror. Hesitation was betrayal. Questioning was treason. The system would kill you for disobedience, and it would kill you for insufficient enthusiasm and enforcement. He watched the officer walk away. Two bodies in the street, bread scattered around them, people averting their eyes and walking faster. This is what we've become, Petrov thought. This is what the system requires. Terror that kills civilians and subordinates with equal efficiency. Control maintained not through legitimacy but through fear of immediate execution, and Volkov was staying in Moscow to project confidence and hold the system together. Petrov thought about his wife and children, somewhere east of Moscow, away from this. Safe. He'd made the right choice sending them away. The only choice. But he'd stayed. 20 years of conditioning, 20 years of believing that duty mattered and systems held, and someone had to maintain order. He walked back toward the Kremlin through streets that smelled of burning documents and fear, and the approaching end of everything. Inside the administrative building, Irina was at her desk. She looked up when he entered. Meeting in 30 minutes. State Defense Committee. They're making an announcement. What announcement? I don't know, but everyone's being called in. Petrov made his way to the conference room. It was packed. Every administrator, every official, everyone who hadn't evacuated yet. Standing room only. Tension like electricity in the cold air. Volkov entered at exactly the scheduled time. No preamble, no softening. The government is evacuating. Foreign embassies are relocating. Critical infrastructure is being moved east. This is necessary for continuity of the state if Moscow falls. I am staying. I will remain in the capital. Visible, present, the embodiment of Soviet power in its capital. Silence. Complete shock. The leader was staying when everyone else was leaving. Order will be maintained. Looters will be shot on sight. Anyone spreading panic will be arrested. The NKVD will enforce absolute control. We will hold this city. We will defend this capital. We will not surrender to panic before the Germans arrive. Then the part that made half the room think he'd lost his mind. On November 7th, Revolution Day, there will be a military parade in Red Square. Normal schedule, normal ceremony, as if nothing unusual is happening, because nothing unusual is happening. The Soviet Union defends its capital. The Red Army holds its positions. The leader remains at his post. This is not exceptional. This is duty. Petrov looked around the room, shock on every face. The Germans were 60 miles away, maybe less, racing toward Moscow, and the leader wanted to hold a parade in Red Square, while the enemy could potentially hear the artillery from their forward positions. It was either the most confident display of leadership imaginable or the delusion of a man unable to accept reality. After the meeting, Petrov overheard two officials talking in the hallway. He's gambling everything on theater, on symbols, on the appearance of confidence. Or he understands that in a system built on projected power, appearance is reality. If he stays and projects confidence, maybe the system holds. Maybe people believe victory is possible. Maybe that belief translates to actual defense. And if he's wrong, then we're all dead or captured within 2 weeks. Petrov walked back to his office, sat at his desk, looked at the papers waiting for review. The ordinary machinery of administration, continuing because no one had officially told it to stop. He thought about the officer shooting the looter, then shooting his own subordinate for hesitating. Thought about the system that required that brutality. Thought about the leader who'd created that system now, betting everything that the same system could be held together through confidence and will. Outside his window, Moscow burned. Documents in oil drums, ash falling like snow. People fleeing or looting or preparing for the end. And somewhere in the Kremlin, Volkov sat in his cold office and made plans for a parade that would happen in 3 weeks. While the Germans raced toward the city, while the system teetered on collapse, while everything hung in the balance. Petrov didn't know if it would work, didn't know if projection of confidence could substitute for military capability, didn't know if will could hold systems together when those systems were built on foundations that had already cracked. But Volkov was betting everything on it. His life, the capital, the entire structure of Soviet power. Stay in Moscow, project confidence, hold a parade while the enemy approaches. Tell everyone through action that victory is inevitable, even when every assessment says defeat is likely. Petrov looked at the papers on his desk and decided, if the leader can stay, I can stay. If the system requires maintainers, I'll maintain it. Not because I believe in inevitable victory, but because someone has to keep working while others decide whether we live or die. He picked up the first report and started reading. Food supply allocations, winter fuel stockpiles, the ordinary details of extraordinary times. Outside, Moscow prepared for the end. Inside the Kremlin, one man prepared to gamble everything on the possibility that what could matter more than weapons. October 21st, 1941. 6 days after the announcement. The cold came early that year. Major Heinrich Weber, 38 years old, Wehrmacht reconnaissance officer, 3rd Panzer Group, sat in a commandeered farmhouse 28 miles west of Moscow and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius overnight. Not the killing cold that would come later, not yet, but cold enough that vehicles were starting to fail. Cold enough that men were wrapping their feet in newspaper under their boots because the standard issue footwear wasn't designed for Russian winter. Nobody had planned for Russian winter. The operation was supposed to be finished by now. France had fallen in 6 weeks, Poland in less. The Soviet Union, disorganized, demoralized, led by incompetent officers who'd been promoted only because their predecessors had been executed, should have collapsed by September. October at the latest. It was late October. They were 28 miles from Moscow, close enough to smell victory, far enough that every mile cost more than the last. Weber had been with the Wehrmacht since the Poland campaign. He'd seen the blitzkrieg work exactly as designed. Rapid mechanized advance, encirclement of enemy forces, collapse of defensive lines, victory through speed and shock, and the paralysis of enemy command structures that couldn't adapt fast enough. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It had been working in Russia until the weather turned and the distances started mattering, and the Soviet forces, despite catastrophic losses, kept fighting instead of surrendering. The problem wasn't Russian courage. Weber respected the enemy soldiers. They fought hard, died hard. The problem was that there were always more of them. Encircle an army, capture 300,000 prisoners, and another army materialized somewhere else. Kill a division, and 2 more appeared. It was like fighting an enemy with infinite reserves and no concept of when to quit. But the reserves had to be running out. Intelligence said so. Every assessment confirmed it. The Soviets had lost over 3 million men, killed, wounded, captured. They'd lost vast industrial regions. They'd lost cities and resources and most of their experienced leadership. They were fighting with junior officers and conscripts in desperation. One more push. That's what every briefing said. One more offensive and Moscow falls and the Soviet Union shatters, and the war in the East is finished before winter makes combat impossible. Weber's adjutant, Lieutenant Franz Kessler, entered the farmhouse. 26 years old, Bavarian, good soldier, increasingly worried eyes. Orders from Division Major, full offensive resumes tomorrow morning. All units advance toward Moscow. Final push. What about fuel supplies? Adequate for 3 days of operations. Resupply convoy coming up behind us. Ammunition? Sufficient, assuming we don't run into serious resistance. And if we do? Kessler hesitated. Then we'll need resupply faster than the convoys can reach us. Weber walked to the map pinned on the farmhouse wall. 28 miles to Moscow. The map made it look simple. Just distance. Just terrain. But Weber had been fighting in Russia long enough to know that maps lied. 28 miles in Russian autumn, in increasingly cold weather, against an enemy that kept fighting despite impossible odds, with supply lines stretched thin and vehicles failing and men exhausted from months of continuous combat. How's morale? Weber asked. The men want to finish this. They're tired. They're cold. But they believe Moscow is the end. Take the capital, win the war, go home. That belief keeps them moving. Do you believe it? Kessler looked at him. I want to believe it, sir. But I've been watching Russian prisoners. They're exhausted, poorly equipped, barely trained, but they're not defeated, not broken. They still believe they can win. I don't understand it. We've destroyed their armies. We're at the gates of their capital, but they haven't given up. Some enemies don't know when they're beaten, Weber said. Napoleon learned that. Maybe we're learning it too. Are you comparing us to Napoleon? Napoleon reached Moscow, occupied it, still lost the war, lost his army, lost everything. Weber turned from the map. But we're not Napoleon. We have better logistics, better equipment, better understanding of what we're facing, and we're not going to make his mistakes. He said it with confidence because that's what officers did. Projected confidence, kept men believing, maintained morale even when doubt was creeping in. But privately, alone in the cold farmhouse, Weber wondered, are we repeating history? Are we pushing too far, too fast, into a country that's too big and too cold and defended by people who don't know when to quit? He pushed the thought away. Tomorrow they'd advance. Tomorrow they'd push toward Moscow. Tomorrow they'd finish what they'd started 6 months ago. Outside, snow began falling. Early for snow. But everything about this campaign had been unexpected. The distances, the resistance, the weather, the sense that victory was always just one more battle away, but never quite arriving. Weber wrote a letter to his wife, Sophie, back in Hamburg. He'd been writing her throughout the campaign. Short letters, optimistic, carefully censored, telling her he was safe, the war was going well, he'd be home soon. Sophie, he wrote, we're close now, very close. Moscow is within reach. In a few days, maybe a week, this will be finished. The capital will fall, and the enemy will have to sue for peace. No nation can continue fighting after losing its capital. This is almost over. I'll be home before Christmas, I promise. He sealed the letter and gave it to Kessler for the mail courier, knowing the promise might be a lie. Knowing that soldiers had been promising to be home by Christmas since August, and it was almost November and they were still here, still fighting, still dying in a country that seemed determined to consume everyone who entered it. But hope mattered. Promises mattered. The belief that this had to end soon, because the alternative, years more of this, was unthinkable. Weber tried to sleep. The cold kept him awake. The cold and the sound of wind outside, and the knowledge that tomorrow they'd advance again into forests and frozen fields where Russian soldiers waited in positions they'd fight to hold, because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. 100 miles east, Lieutenant Alexei Kuznetsov's platoon held a defensive position in frozen forest north of Moscow. The position wasn't much. Trenches dug in ground that was starting to freeze solid. Log bunkers that provided some protection from wind, but none from cold. 40 men when they'd arrived 3 weeks ago. 32 now, not from combat, from exposure, frostbite, hypothermia. The cold-killing men before the Germans arrived. Kuznetsov was starting to understand that the cold was a weapon, not his weapon or the German weapon. A third force that killed everyone equally but killed the unprepared faster. The Germans had better equipment, but they weren't prepared for Russian winter. Soviet forces were better adapted, but they didn't have adequate winter gear either. Both sides were dying. The question was who would die faster. Sergeant Pavel Denisov, 52, Finnish war veteran, was checking the men's feet. Frostbite inspection, daily ritual, critical. Lose your feet. You couldn't fight. Lose too many men to frostbite, the position couldn't be held. Mikhailov, get over here, Pavel called. A young soldier, maybe 19, approached. Pavel pointed at his boots. Take them off. The kid hesitated. Taking off boots in this cold meant exposing feet to temperatures that could cause damage in minutes. Now, Pavel said. The soldier complied. Pavel examined his feet. 2 toes on the left foot were white, dead tissue. Frostbite past the point of recovery. Field hospital now. You're done. Sergeant, I can still fight. You can still die. Hospital. Get someone to walk with you. Don't go alone or you'll freeze before you get there. The soldier left. 31 men now. No replacements coming, just attrition. Slow bleeding of combat capability through cold and exhaustion and the endless strain of waiting for an attack that could come any hour. Kuznetsov watched the exchange. Pavel had fought in the Finnish War, 1939 to 1940, Soviet invasion of Finland that had been a disaster. Massive casualties, poor planning. Soviet forces unprepared for winter combat against an enemy that knew the terrain. The war that should have taught them lessons about winter warfare. Maybe it had taught some lessons. Not enough. Never enough. How bad is it? Kuznetsov asked Pavel quietly. Bad. We're losing men faster than we can afford. Another week of this cold without proper gear will be at half strength before the Germans attack. Reinforcements? Haven't seen any. Every unit on this line is in the same situation. Holding positions with whatever men we have left. Waiting for an offensive everyone knows is coming, but nobody knows when. Do we hold when they attack? Pavel looked at him, hard eyes and a weathered face. We hold as long as we can, then we fall back to the next position and hold there. That's how defense works. You don't hold forever, you hold long enough. Long enough for what? Long enough for someone somewhere to figure out how to win. That's above our level. We just hold our piece of the line and trust that someone has a plan. Kuznetsov didn't ask if Pavel believed someone had a plan. The answer would be honest, and the honesty would be depressing. Better to operate on the assumption that someone somewhere knew what they were doing. Better than accepting that everyone was improvising and hoping and dying while waiting for miracles. That night, November 3rd, Kuznetsov's platoon was pulled back from the front line. Not for rest. For rotation to Moscow for the Revolution Day parade. Orders from above. Selected units would participate in the parade. Show of strength. Projection of confidence. Proof that the Red Army was intact and fighting and confident of victory. The men didn't understand it. Didn't want it. They wanted rest. Wanted warmth. Wanted to not march in formation while comrades held the line. But orders were orders. Disobedience meant execution. Questioning meant suspicion. You followed orders and hoped they made sense to someone even if they made no sense to you. They marched to Moscow through snow. 20 miles. Took a day and a half. Men falling out from exhaustion. Officers pushing them to keep moving because falling behind meant freezing to death on the road. Moscow looked worse than the front. That's what surprised Kuznetsov. At the front you expected disaster, expected death and cold and misery. But Moscow was supposed to be the capital, the heart of Soviet power, the place that was safe and organized and functioning. Instead, it looked like a city preparing for apocalypse. Burned documents everywhere. Ash in the streets. Buildings damaged from bombing. People moving fast, eyes down, not making eye contact. The atmosphere of a place where trust had collapsed and everyone was surviving however they could. They were billeted in a school building that had been converted to barracks. Cold but warmer than the forest. Food that wasn't great but was better than what they'd been eating. 12 hours of rest that felt like luxury after weeks in frozen trenches. Kuznetsov met a woman at the food distribution point. Anna Volkova, 34. Factory worker, distributing bread to soldiers. Thin, exhausted, but still working, still functioning. You're from the front? She asked. North sector, forest defense. How is it? Cold. We're losing men to frostbite faster than combat, but we're holding. Do you think we can win? Kuznetsov looked at her. The honest answer was he didn't know. Couldn't know. The situation was desperate and getting worse, and every day felt like postponing inevitable defeat rather than working toward possible victory. But he said, we're still fighting. That has to count for something. Anna nodded. My husband died at Smolensk. I got the notification 6 weeks ago. Body never recovered, just missing, presumed dead. I have 2 children. I work the factory 20 hours a day making ammunition. I don't know if we can win, but I know we can't give up, because if we give up, everything he died for means nothing. That's what Kuznetsov realized about Moscow. It wasn't organized strength. It was organized desperation. People working past exhaustion, fighting past hope, continuing because stopping meant accepting defeat, and defeat meant everything had been for nothing. November 6th, evening before the parade. Dmitry Petrov was on the reviewing platform in Red Square, organizing logistics for tomorrow's parade. He'd been working 18-hour days for 3 weeks, coordinating food supplies, managing evacuations, processing endless paperwork that maintained the fiction that systems were still functioning normally. The parade was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Military units would march through Red Square. Tanks would roll across cobblestones. Artillery would be displayed. The leader would review the troops from Lenin's mausoleum. Normal Revolution Day ceremony, as if Germans weren't 25 miles away, as if the situation wasn't desperate, as if everything was fine. Petrov had stopped questioning the logic. Either the parade would project confidence that helped hold the city together, or it would be a final theatrical gesture before collapse. Either way, his job was to make sure it happened. Logistics, coordination, the machinery of administration continuing because no one had officially told it to stop. He watched workers setting up reviewing stands, watched security forces positioning, watched the mundane preparation for something that was either brilliant psychology or final delusion. An NKVD officer approached him. "We have intelligence. Germans are planning to attack during the parade. Tomorrow afternoon. Multiple vectors. Timing deliberate. Hit us while leadership is exposed and troops are committed to ceremony." Petrov stared at him. "You're certain?" "Prisoner interrogation. Captured officer confirmed it. Germans think they're clever. Attack while we're distracted." "Does the leader know?" "He's been informed. Response was to continue parade as scheduled." "That's insane. If they attack during the parade, then we respond. But parade continues. That's the order." Petrov walked away trying to process. The leader knew attack was coming during parade and was continuing anyway. Either supreme confidence or complete detachment from reality. Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter which. That night, Volkov met with Sokolov in the Kremlin office. Cold as always. Maps on the walls. Reports on the desk. The machinery of war compressed into one room. "The Siberian divisions are in position," Sokolov said. 100,000 men. Winter equipment. Ready for counteroffensive. But you're holding a parade tomorrow while Germans attack. I need those troops for defense if you're determined to do this. The parade projects confidence. The troops remain hidden until the moment they're needed. Germans believe we have no reserves. Let them continue believing it until we hit them with force they didn't expect. You're gambling. I'm gambling on surprise, on enemy assumptions, on the possibility that showing strength while holding hidden reserves creates psychological effect that matters as much as military effect. Sokolov looked at him. "October 10th, I told you I didn't know if we could hold Moscow. You asked if I was sure. I said no, but we had to try. Now I'm asking you, are you sure this theater matters? Sure enough to risk everything on it?" Volkov walked to the window. Outside, Moscow in darkness. Blackout conditions because German bombers came at night. A city hiding, preparing, waiting. "I'm not sure," he said, "but I'm doing it anyway. Because in a system built on projected power, perception is reality. The parade tomorrow tells everyone, our people, our military, the enemy, that we're not defeated, not broken, not afraid. That message might hold the system together long enough for your military competence to finish what my political decision started. And if the message fails, if the parade doesn't matter and the Germans break through, then I die in Moscow and you retreat with the Siberian divisions and try to hold somewhere else. But at least we tried. At least we didn't surrender to panic before the battle was decided." Sokolov left. Volkov sat alone in the cold office. He thought about choices made, purges that eliminated competence along with potential threats. Refusal to believe intelligence about German invasion, interference in military operations, all the mistakes that led to this moment. And now one choice that might be right. Stay in Moscow. Project confidence. Hold parade while enemy approaches. Gamble that will and theater can matter as much as weapons and tactics. He didn't know if it would work, but he knew that leaving would guarantee failure. Staying gave possibility of success. Possibility was better than certainty of defeat. Tomorrow the parade would happen. Tomorrow the Germans would attack. Tomorrow they'd find out if confidence could substitute for capability. If symbols mattered as much as substance. If one right choice could begin to redeem 10 wrong ones. November 7th, 1941. Revolution Day. Dawn came cold and gray. Snow falling steadily. Red Square covered in white. The cobblestones where tanks would roll, hidden under snow that workers had been clearing since 4 in the morning. Kuznetsov's platoon formed up at 6, 31 men in formation. Uniforms as clean as possible given the circumstances. Equipment checked. Ready to march from Red Square directly to the front lines. Everyone knew it. March in the parade, get reviewed by the leader, then straight back to frozen trenches. Some of them wouldn't survive the week. Maybe none of them. But this morning they'd march in Red Square and represent something larger than themselves. The men were quiet. No jokes, no conversation. Just cold men in formation waiting for orders that would take them to ceremony and then to death. Pavel checked the line one last time, adjusted one soldier's uniform, nodded to Kuznetsov. Ready? Do you believe in this? Kuznetsov asked quietly. The parade, the theater, does it matter? Pavel looked at him. I believe in this. We're still fighting. The leader stayed when he could have fled. That counts for something. Maybe not enough, but something. Anna Volkova stood in the crowd with other factory workers. Required attendance. Show of unity. She was exhausted. 20-hour factory shifts for 3 weeks. Living on 4 hours of sleep. Surviving on bread and whatever else she could find. 2 children at home with a neighbor because she had to be here. Had to show support. Had to participate in the machinery of projected confidence. She watched soldiers forming up. Young men. Most of them would be dead in weeks. She knew it. They knew it. Everyone knew it. But they were marching anyway, following orders, doing their duty, trusting that someone somewhere had a plan. Her husband had done the same. Marched to Smolensk. Followed orders. Died somewhere in the encirclement. Body never recovered. Just missing, presumed dead. Everything he'd believed in, gone. Everything he'd fought for, uncertain. And now she stood in Red Square watching more young men prepare to die for a cause that might already be lost. But she also understood, if we stop believing, it's definitely lost. If we keep fighting, maybe there's chance. Small chance, but chance. Dmitry Petrov was on the platform behind where the leader would stand, coordinating, managing, ensuring everything happened according to plan. He'd been working since midnight, checking every detail, making sure ceremony would proceed smoothly, even though Germans were 25 miles away and planning to attack this afternoon. The absurdity of it struck him again. They were holding a parade while the enemy prepared to destroy them. Either brilliant psychology or final madness. He'd stopped being able to tell the difference. 10 in the morning. The leader emerged from the Kremlin and walked to the reviewing platform. Sergei Volkov, 62 years old, wearing simple military-style tunic. No elaborate uniform. No excessive decoration. Just the leader, visible, present, embodying Soviet power in its capital. The soldiers began marching. Boots on cobblestones. Rhythm perfect despite cold and exhaustion. Tanks rolling. Artillery being towed. The machinery of military power displayed for everyone to see. And in the distance, if you listen carefully, you could hear artillery. Not the parade artillery. Real artillery from the front lines 25 miles away, where men were dying while their comrades marched in ceremony. The symbolism was overwhelming. While Germans sat in frozen positions, exhausted and undersupplied, watching and waiting to attack, Soviet forces were conducting business as usual. Revolution Day parade happening on schedule because Soviet state was eternal, unshakable, destined to triumph. But it was the speech that would matter. Everyone knew it. The marching was theater. The speech was message. Volkov stepped to the microphone. His voice carried across the square through loudspeakers. Georgian accent thick. Voice rough, but strong. Certain. Comrades, we celebrate the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution in difficult conditions. He didn't minimize it, didn't pretend everything was fine. Acknowledged reality that every person in that square understood. The perfidious attack by the German fascists and the war that has been forced upon us have created a threat to our country. The enemy was named, the threat was real. No lies, no false comfort. The enemy is cruel and implacable. He is out to seize our lands watered with our sweat, to seize our grain and oil secured by our labor. He is out to restore the rule of landlords, to restore Tsarism, to destroy national culture and the national state existence of the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Moldavians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and the other free peoples of the Soviet Union. This wasn't just about communism, it was about civilization, about identity, about everything that transcended ideology. And then the pivot, the moment everyone would remember. Let the manly images of our great ancestors inspire you in this war. Kuznetsov, standing in formation, felt something shift. The leader was invoking history older than communism, reaching back to something deeper. Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kuzma Minin, Dmitry Pojarsky, Alexander Suvorov, Mikhail Kutuzov. Medieval princes who'd fought off invaders, generals who'd defeated Napoleon. Russian heroes, not communist heroes. The leader was wrapping Soviet cause in Russian identity, connecting present struggle to centuries of defense against invasion. Anna Volkova, standing in the crowd, felt tears freezing on her cheeks. Those were her ancestors, not party propaganda, not communist mythology, real historical figures who defended Russia when Russia was threatened. The connection went deeper than politics, deeper than ideology. All the way to bedrock of who they were as people. Let the victorious banner of the great Lenin inspire you in this war. Back to communism, but only after establishing connection to something older and deeper. Death to the German invaders! The roar from the crowd and soldiers was genuine, not forced, not theatrical. Real emotion from people who'd been given permission to feel something beyond party loyalty. Permission to fight for Russia, not just for communism. Permission to connect present struggle to historical pattern of survival against overwhelming odds. The soldiers marched from Red Square. Many of them would be dead within days. But they marched believing that what they were fighting for mattered, that the leader believed in victory, that the system would hold, that Moscow would stand. Behind the scenes, aides handed Volkov a note during the parade. German attack beginning, multiple vectors, as intelligence had predicted, timing deliberate, hit Soviet forces while they were committed to ceremony. Volkov read the note, didn't flinch, continued reviewing troops. After 5 minutes, he leaned to Sokolov beside him and said quietly, "Now? Not yet. Let them extend. Let them commit. Then we hit them." Volkov nodded, turned back to the parade, watched his army march past while enemy attacked, projected absolute confidence even though everything hung in balance. 25 miles west, Major Heinrich Weber's unit began the final assault on Moscow. The order had come at noon. All units advance, maximum effort, break through Soviet lines, reach Moscow before nightfall. End this. Weber's reconnaissance unit moved through snow-covered forest. Visibility poor, temperature -20, vehicles struggling, men exhausted, but orders were orders and Moscow was close, and this had to be the final push because they couldn't sustain this much longer. They hit the first Soviet defensive line at 1 in the afternoon. Expected resistance? Got it. Soviets fighting from prepared positions, dug in, determined. The usual pattern. Fight hard, inflict casualties. Eventually retreat to next position. But something was different. The resistance was more organized, more coordinated, as if someone had planned this defense instead of just throwing units into line and hoping they'd hold. Weber's unit pushed through, took casualties, more than expected, but they advanced, cleared the first defensive line, moved toward the second. The second line was harder, heavier resistance, better position. Soviet artillery that actually seemed to know where German forces were, counter-battery fire that was unusual in its accuracy. By 4 in the afternoon, Weber's unit had advanced 3 miles. 3 miles in 5 hours. At that rate, they'd reach Moscow in 4 days. Not tonight, not tomorrow. 4 days if they could maintain this pace. 4 days if Soviet resistance didn't strengthen. 4 days if weather didn't worsen and supplies didn't run out and men didn't collapse from exhaustion. Weber realized, we're not going to make it. Not this offensive. Not now. We're extended too far. Exhausted. Undersupplied. and the Russians are fighting harder than they should be able to given everything they've lost. That night his unit halted, dug in, prepared for Soviet counterattack that might come. The temperature dropped to -30. Men were dying from cold. Vehicles wouldn't start. The offensive had stalled, not stopped, stalled. They could resume tomorrow. Push harder, maybe break through, maybe reach Moscow. But Weber, sitting in a frozen hole that barely qualified as shelter, began to doubt. Began to wonder if the race to Moscow was repeating history. If they were Napoleon's army, reaching for a capital that kept retreating just beyond grasp. If the cold and distance and Russian determination would destroy them the way it had destroyed invaders before. He pushed the doubt away. Tomorrow they'd advance. Tomorrow they'd push harder. Tomorrow they'd finish this. But the doubt remained, quiet, growing. The sense that history was repeating and they were on the wrong side of the pattern. November 15th, 1941, the German offensive continued, not as planned. Not with the decisive breakthrough that would crack Soviet lines and allow rapid advance to Moscow, but grinding forward, taking positions, losing men, advancing at costs that kept climbing. Kuznetsov's platoon was back in the forest. 28 men now. 3 more lost to frostbite during the week after the parade, holding a position that had been overrun and retaken twice in 3 days. Fighting Germans who were exhausted and frozen but still pushing, still believing that one more effort would break through. The fighting was brutal. Close quarters in forest, visibility limited by trees and snow, temperatures that made weapons malfunction, and men die from exposure as much as enemy fire. Both sides dying. Question was who died faster. Pavel was shot on November 18th. Covering withdrawal when German forces pushed through their position, took bullets covering his men so they could fall back to next line. Died doing what he'd always done, holding until others could escape. Kuznetsov found his body the next day when they counterattacked and retook the position. Pavel was frozen in the trench where he'd fallen, still holding his rifle, still facing the direction the Germans had come from. 27 men now, no replacements, just attrition. Slow bleeding that couldn't be sustained much longer. But intelligence started filtering down from command. Something was happening, something behind the lines. Movement of forces, preparation for something big. Nobody knew what, just rumors, hope, the possibility that someone somewhere had a plan beyond hold until you die. November 28th, 1941. Weber's unit reached Chimki, northern suburb of Moscow, 12 miles from the Kremlin, close enough that officers could see golden domes through binoculars on clear days, close enough to smell victory. But they couldn't go further. Exhausted, undersupplied, frozen. The offensive had pushed them to the limit and beyond. Men were dying from cold and exhaustion faster than from combat. Vehicles abandoned because they wouldn't start. Artillery out of ammunition because supply convoys couldn't reach them fast enough. Weber stood in Chimki and looked south toward Moscow. So close. 12 miles. Nothing. A morning's march under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. 12 miles through defended positions in frozen terrain and temperatures that killed everyone equally. 12 miles that might as well be 1,200. He wrote another letter to Sophie, told her they'd reached the suburbs of Moscow, told her victory was close, told her he'd be home soon, but he didn't believe it anymore. Sitting in a frozen house in Chimki, watching men die from cold, watching vehicles fail, watching the offensive grind to halt just short of objective, Weber began to understand. We've lost, not yet, not officially, but we've pushed as far as we can push, and it wasn't far enough. The capital is there, visible, but unreachable, and winter is coming. Real winter. Killing winter. And we're not prepared for it. That night, November 28th, midnight, Volkov and Sokolov met in the Kremlin office. Germans are at Chimki, Sokolov reported. 12 miles, but they're finished. Extended past breaking point, exhausted, undersupplied. They can't push further. When do you counterattack? December 5th. Give them another week to exhaust themselves completely, then hit them with Siberian divisions, fresh troops, winter equipment, Attack when they're too frozen and exhausted to respond effectively. Are you sure it will work? Sokolov looked at him. Role reversal from October 10th. Then Volkov had asked if Moscow could be held. Sokolov had said he didn't know. Now Volkov was asking if counteroffensive would work. Time for honesty. No, but you were right about the theater, the parade, the projection of confidence. It held the city together, held the army together. Now let's see if you're right about will mattering, because that's what this counteroffensive is. Will, determination, refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seems inevitable. Volkov nodded slowly. October 10th, you told me truth. I made decision based on your honesty. Now you're making decision based on my gamble. If it fails, we've both failed. But at least we tried. At least we didn't surrender to panic or run from the fight. That has to count for something. Does it? Ask me in a week, after the counteroffensive, after we know if this worked or if we're all dead. December 4th, 1941. Evening. Kuznetsov's platoon was pulled from the line again, not for rest, for preparation. Something was happening. Orders coming down. Movement behind the lines. Sense that everything was about to change. They were positioned in forest 15 miles north of Moscow. 26 men now. One more lost to frostbite. But reinforcements had arrived. Strange reinforcements. Soldiers in white winter camouflage. Proper cold weather gear. Moving with efficiency that spoke of training and preparation. Siberian troops. Hundreds of them in this sector. Maybe thousands. Maybe more. Nobody explained where they came from. Just orders. Prepare for attack. December 5th, dawn, full offensive. Take back everything the Germans had captured. Kuznetsov looked at his exhausted men. Looked at the fresh Siberian troops. Understood. Someone did have a plan. Someone was gambling that fresh forces could break exhausted enemy. That winter and surprise could substitute for numbers and equipment. It might work, might not. But at least they were attacking. At least they weren't just holding and dying. At least someone was trying to win instead of just postponing defeat. Pavel was dead. 15 men from the original 40 were dead or missing. Moscow had nearly fallen. The system had nearly collapsed. Everything had been on the edge of disaster. But they'd held. Barely. By will and desperation, and the gamble that confidence could matter as much as capability. Now they'd attack. December 5th, dawn. And they'd find out if holding had been enough. If sacrifice had meaning. If the stand at Moscow was the beginning of something or just postponement of inevitable end. Kuznetsov checked his pistol. Checked his men. Waited for dawn. December 5th, 1941. 4:47 in the morning. Where this started. The attack began in silence. No artillery barrage. No warning. Just 100,000 Soviet soldiers rising from frozen positions across the entire Moscow defensive perimeter and moving forward through pre-dawn darkness. The Germans, exhausted and frozen in their forward positions, convinced that the Soviets had nothing left, suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy that shouldn't exist. Kuznetsov moved through snow-covered forest with 26 men who'd survived 8 weeks of hell and 100 Siberian soldiers who moved like winter itself had taken human form. The contrast was striking. Kuznetsov's men stumbled through snow, exhausted, running on desperation and the momentum of finally attacking instead of defending. The Siberians flowed through the terrain, white camouflage making them nearly invisible, winter gear allowing them to operate efficiently in temperatures that crippled everyone else. They hit the first German position at 5 in the morning, a forward outpost. 20 German soldiers in a makeshift bunker, half frozen, weapons barely functional in the cold. The fight lasted 3 minutes. The Germans tried to resist, but their rifles wouldn't fire reliably, and they couldn't move fast in the cold, and the Siberians were on them before they could organize defense. Kuznetsov watched a Siberian sergeant, a man maybe 35, hard face, no wasted movement, clear the bunker with brutal efficiency. No hesitation, no mercy, just professional violence from men who'd been trained for exactly this. They pushed forward. The plan was simple. Break through forward positions, encircle German spearheads, cut off their retreat, force surrender or destruction. The Siberians led. Kuznetsov's platoon followed, providing support, learning how winter warfare was supposed to work from men who actually knew. By 6 in the morning, they'd advanced 2 miles. 2 miles in an hour. After 8 weeks of losing ground 1 bloody meter at a time, they were taking it back in great chunks. The Germans weren't broken yet, but they were reeling, surprised, disorganized. Fighting an enemy they'd been told didn't exist with resources they'd been assured were depleted. At 7, Kuznetsov's unit encountered serious resistance, a German defensive position with machine guns and prepared fields of fire. The kind of position that would have stopped them cold a week ago. The Siberians assessed the situation for 90 seconds, then moved. Flanking maneuver through heavy snow, suppressing fire, coordinated assault that overwhelmed the position before Germans could adjust. 3 of Kuznetsov's men died in the assault, but they took the position, and behind it was German supply depot, vehicles, ammunition, food, most of it abandoned because vehicles wouldn't start and Germans were falling back faster than they could evacuate supplies. The Siberian sergeant walked over to Kuznetsov. "First time attacking?" "Yes. You're learning. Your men move too slow. They think too much. In attack, you move fast and think later. Hesitation gets you killed. We've been defending for 2 months. We're good at defending. Defense is waiting to die. Attack is choosing where the dying happens. Better psychology." They pushed forward. By noon, Kuznetsov's sector had advanced 6 miles. 6 miles in 7 hours. The German front line hadn't collapsed yet, but it was buckling. Units falling back in disorder. Positions abandoned. The Wehrmacht, undefeated in major battle for 2 years, was retreating. Not everywhere. Some German units were holding, fighting with the same desperate competence that Soviet forces had shown for 8 weeks. But the overall pattern was clear. The offensive had stalled. The assault on Moscow had failed. Now it was Soviet turn to push. 12 miles away, Major Heinrich Weber understood that everything had gone wrong. His unit in Chimki, 12 miles from the Kremlin, close enough to see the Golden Domes on clear days, was being overrun. Not by the demoralized, poorly equipped Soviet forces they'd been fighting for months, by fresh troops in winter gear who moved through snow like they owned it and attacked with coordination that spoke of actual military competence. Weber had been preparing morning reports when the attack hit. 5 in the morning. No warning. Suddenly, his forward positions were reporting Soviet assault from multiple directions. Fresh forces, winter equipment, numbers that didn't match any intelligence assessment. Where did they come from? That was the question that kept repeating. Intelligence had said the Soviets were finished. No reserves, no capability for offensive operations, just desperate defense that would eventually collapse. Every assessment confirmed it. Every briefing repeated it. But here they were, 100,000 men, maybe more, attacking across the entire front. Fresh, equipped, organized, as if the last 4 months of catastrophic Soviet losses had been preparation for this moment instead of evidence of impending defeat. Weber's unit tried to hold Chimki, tried to maintain the position they'd bled to take, but by 8 in the morning it was clear they couldn't. Soviet forces were pushing from 3 directions. German units on both flanks were falling back. Staying meant encirclement and destruction. The order came at 9. Retreat. Fall back to defensive positions 10 miles west. Preserve combat capability. Regroup. Retreat. The word that hadn't been used in 2 years of German victories. Retreat from Moscow. From the capital that was supposed to fall and end the war. From the objective that had cost thousands of German lives and was now slipping away like smoke. Weber's unit began pulling back, not in organized withdrawal, in something approaching rout. Vehicles abandoned because they wouldn't start in minus 35-degree cold. Heavy equipment left behind because there was no fuel to move it. Men throwing away weapons and gear to move faster, to escape the Soviet forces pressing from behind. Weber tried to maintain order, tried to keep his men together, but panic was infectious and defeat was novel, and the cold was killing anyone who moved too slow. By noon, his unit had retreated 8 miles, lost half their equipment, lost dozens of men to Soviet fire and to cold and to simple exhaustion. He thought about the letter he'd written to Sophie, told her they'd reached Moscow, told her victory was close, told her he'd be home by Christmas. All lies now. Not intentional lies. Lies built on assumptions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but lies nonetheless. The truth was this. They'd reached the gates of Moscow and been thrown back. The Wehrmacht, invincible for 2 years, had been defeated. Not destroyed, not annihilated, but defeated. Forced to retreat. Forced to admit that the objective was unreachable and the campaign had failed. By evening, Weber's unit was 20 miles from Moscow, dug into frozen ground, trying to establish defensive positions, trying to process what had happened. The certainty of victory that had sustained them for months had shattered. Now there was just cold and retreat and the growing realization that this war wasn't going to end the way they'd expected. That night, Weber was captured. Soviet reconnaissance patrol overran his position. He was too cold to fight effectively, too exhausted to run. He surrendered, became prisoner of war, began a journey that would take him through POW camps and survival, and eventual return to Germany years later with nothing but memories of how close they'd come and how completely they'd failed. December 8, 1941. The Soviet counteroffensive continued, not everywhere with equal success. Some sectors the Germans held. Some retreats were organized and effective, but the overall pattern was clear. Moscow was saved. The Germans were being pushed back. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was broken. Kuznetsov's platoon had advanced 15 miles in 3 days. 15 miles through territory they'd lost over 8 weeks. They were liberating villages, finding Soviet civilians who'd been living under German occupation for weeks, finding German supply depots abandoned in the retreat, finding evidence everywhere that the enemy who'd seemed unstoppable was actually exhausted and overstretched and vulnerable. But the cost was brutal. 26 men had become 19. Not all from combat, 3 from frostbite, 2 from exhaustion, 1 from simple accident, fell through ice on frozen stream and drowned before anyone could reach him. The cold was still killing. The advance was still bleeding them. Victory wasn't free, just possible. On December 10th, they found Pavel's body. The position where he died 3 weeks ago, covering retreat, had changed hands 4 times since then. Pavel was still there, frozen in the trench where he'd fallen, still holding his rifle, still facing the direction the Germans had come from. Kuznetsov and what remained of the original 40 men, 11 of them now, buried Pavel in frozen ground. No time for elaborate ceremony, no resources for proper burial. Just the acknowledgement that he'd done his job, held his position, died so others could retreat. The kind of death that war required and nobody wanted to think about too much. They marked the grave with his rifle, moved on, kept advancing because the offensive was continuing and stopping meant giving Germans time to regroup. By December 15th, the counteroffensive had pushed Germans back 60 to 150 miles from Moscow, depending on sector. The immediate threat to the capital was eliminated. Moscow was saved. The Soviet Union would continue fighting. The war would continue. But at what cost? December 16th, 1941. Moscow. Anna Volkova stood at a memorial wall in central Moscow. Temporary structure, names inscribed of soldiers killed in the defense of the capital. Her husband's name was there, killed at Smolensk in September. One name among thousands, one death among millions. She'd worked the munitions factory 20-hour shifts for 3 months, survived German bombing, survived the panic of October when the government evacuated, survived the uncertainty of November when Germans reached the suburbs, survived the desperation of waiting to see if counteroffensive would work. Now Moscow was saved. The factory was still operating. She was still producing ammunition because the war was continuing, and victory at Moscow didn't mean victory in the war. Just meant survival. Just meant the fight could continue. Other women stood at the memorial. Other widows, other mothers who'd lost sons, other sisters who'd lost brothers. All of them staring at names. All of them processing loss that couldn't be processed. All of them trying to find meaning in sacrifice that had saved the city but cost everything they loved. An older woman beside Anna, maybe 60, said quietly, "We won. My son died in October, but we won. That has to mean something." Anna nodded. My husband died in September, before Moscow was even threatened. He never knew if we'd hold, never knew if his death mattered. Now we know. Moscow held. We survived. His death was part of that. Does it help? Knowing? No. He's still dead. I'm still alone. My children still don't have a father. But at least it wasn't for nothing. At least the city he died defending still stands. The women stood in silence. Around them, Moscow was recovering. Slow recovery. Tentative, but recovery. People returning from evacuation. Factories resuming full production. Administrative systems rebuilding. The machinery of Soviet power continuing because it had survived the moment when survival seemed impossible. Anna returned to her factory. 20-hour shifts continuing. Ammunition production ongoing. The war wasn't over. Moscow was one battle. The Germans still occupied vast Soviet territory, still had millions of soldiers, would regroup and attack again somewhere. The fight would continue for years. The casualties would climb higher, higher than anyone could imagine. But Moscow had held. That was foundation. Everything else would build on that. December 20th, 1941. The Kremlin. Dmitry Petrov sat at his desk processing reports, food supply assessments, winter fuel allocation, housing reconstruction planning, the ordinary machinery of administration that had continued throughout the crisis and would continue after. His family had returned to Moscow 3 days ago, wife and children safe, evacuated in October, brought back in December, reunion that felt like resurrection, like being granted return from the dead. They'd survived. Moscow had survived. Everything that had seemed lost in October was present again in December. But Petrov understood that survival wasn't victory, just postponement of defeat. The Germans would attack again, maybe not Moscow, somewhere else. The war would continue. The system that had barely held through will and desperation would be tested again, and next time maybe will wouldn't be enough. He thought about October 16, watching the woman throw the brick through the bakery window, watching the NKVD officer shoot the looter and then shoot his own subordinate for hesitating. Understanding that the system maintained itself through terror, and that terror would turn on anyone who showed weakness. That system had held, barely, through projection of confidence in brutal enforcement and gamble, that leadership presence mattered more than military capability. It had worked once. Might not work again, but for now it had worked. Petrov signed reports, processed paperwork, maintained the administrative machinery, because that's what functionaries did. Kept systems operating while others decided grand strategy. Kept ordinary processes functioning while extraordinary events unfolded around them. 20 years of conditioning, 20 years of believing that competence and duty mattered. That had almost been destroyed in October, had been vindicated in December, but the vindication was temporary. War continuing, crisis postponed, but not resolved. Everything still uncertain except the certainty that uncertainty would continue. December 25th, 1941, Christmas Day. Volkov sat in his office with Sokolov, cold as always. Maps on walls showing new positions. German retreat, Soviet advance. The battle lines that had seemed fixed in November now fluid in December. Casualty assessment? Volkov asked. Sokolov opened a folder. His face was carefully neutral. Soviet casualties for Battle of Moscow, October through December, 650,000 to 1 million. Military records are deliberately vague, probably closer to the higher number. Dead, wounded, missing, captured. Silence. The number sat in the cold air. 650,000 to 1 million. Soviet casualties to save Moscow, to push Germans back 60 to 150 miles. German casualties, Volkov asked. 250,000 to 400,000. Again, estimates. They don't publicize losses any more than we do. So we lost twice as many to achieve defensive victory and limited counteroffensive? Yes, but we won. Moscow stands. Germans are retreating. Wehrmacht myth of invincibility is broken. First major German defeat of the war. That has strategic value beyond casualty ratios. Volkov stood and walked to the window. Outside, Moscow in winter. covered in snow, damaged from bombing but standing, functioning, surviving. I created the conditions for 1941 disasters, and he said, not defensive, not apologetic, just stating fact. Purges weakened the Red Army. Ignoring intelligence about invasion left us unprepared. Interference in military operations made situations worse. I built this crisis. Yes, Sokolov said. No point softening it. But at Moscow, I made the right call. Stayed when leaving would have guaranteed defeat. Projected confidence when the situation was desperate. Gave you time to organize defense. Trusted intelligence about Japan and pulled Siberian divisions for counteroffensive. All of that worked. Yes. Question is whether one right decision redeems 10 wrong ones. Whether 650,000 dead at Moscow is justified by the 3 million dead before Moscow from mistakes I made. Sokolov considered. I'm a soldier, not a philosopher. You gave me an impossible task. Defend Moscow with inadequate forces against superior enemy. I organized what defense was possible. You stayed and held the system together through projection of will. Together we held. Whether that redeems prior mistakes isn't for me to judge. History will judge. Decades from now, centuries maybe. What's your personal judgment? My personal judgment is this. October 10th, you asked if we could hold Moscow. I told you I didn't know, but we had to try. You made decisions based on that honesty. You could have shot me for defeatism. Instead, you listened, gave me authority, trusted military competence over political considerations. That's why we held. Not because you're perfect, because you finally learned to listen to someone who tells truth. Will I continue making mistakes? Yes. War will continue for years. You'll order disastrous offensives. You'll refuse sensible retreats. You'll rule through terror. Soviet victory will cost 27 million lives before this ends. Maybe more. You'll be responsible for much of that. But you'll also be responsible for the fact that Soviet Union survived when survival seemed impossible. Both things are true. Both things matter. Volkov returned to his desk. Germans still occupy vast territory. Still have millions of soldiers. They'll regroup. Attack south next year. After oil fields, we'll face more crises, more desperate situations. Yes, this was one battle. War continues. But we have foundation now. We proved Wehrmacht can be defeated. We proved Soviet forces can counterattack successfully. We proved that will and desperation can substitute for material advantage when necessary. That's enormous. Strategic assessment for 1942? Sokolov pulled out another map. Germans will attack south, Ukraine, Caucasus, oil fields. We'll trade space for time again. Fight delaying actions, exhaust them, then counterattack when they're overextended. Same pattern as Moscow, but larger scale. Years of grinding warfare. Millions more casualties. Slow bleeding of German capability until they can't sustain offensive operations. How long until victory? 1945, maybe 1946. 4 to 5 more years. 25 to 30 million Soviet dead by the end. Maybe more. Victory at cost that makes Moscow look small. Volkov nodded slowly, processing, understanding, accepting. Then we fight for 4 more years. We accept the casualties. We do what's necessary. Because alternative is defeat in German occupation and destruction of everything we built. Yes. And we start from foundation of Moscow, from proof that we can win, from evidence that staying and fighting matters more than running and surviving. Yes? They sat in silence. 2 men who'd gambled everything on will and projection of confidence and the possibility that symbols mattered as much as substance. 2 men who'd been proven right once and would be tested again and again over years of brutal warfare. Outside, Moscow stood, damaged, exhausted, but standing, capital of Soviet power. City that had been on the verge of collapse in October and was recovering in December. Foundation for everything that would come after. January 1942, Lieutenant Alexei Kuznetsov, promoted to captain now, was training replacement soldiers. His platoon had been rebuilt. 19 survivors from the original 40 plus 31 new conscripts. Young, inexperienced, terrified but trying not to show it. He taught them what Pavel had taught him, how to survive in winter, how to move through snow, how to maintain weapons in extreme cold, how to recognize frostbite before it killed you. The practical skills that Academy didn't teach, but that meant difference between survival and death. He also taught them something else, something he'd learned watching the Siberian soldiers during the counteroffensive. Attack was easier than defense, not less dangerous, just psychologically easier. Moving forward felt like progress, felt like winning. Defense felt like postponing loss. Both were necessary. Both required courage. But attack gave you sense of agency that defense didn't. The new soldiers listened. Some would survive, many wouldn't. That was reality of war. You taught them what you could, hoped it was enough. Sent them into combat knowing that teaching and hope weren't sufficient against bullets and cold, and the 1,000 ways war found to kill people. Kuznetsov thought about Pavel, about the 11 men from original 40 who'd survived, about the 19 who were dead or missing, about the fact that he was alive and promoted and training new soldiers while better men were frozen in unmarked graves in forests around Moscow. Survivors' guilt was real, but guilt was luxury. War continuing. New soldiers needed training. Someone had to teach them. Someone who'd survived and learned. That was his job now. Not fighting on front lines anymore. Training others to fight. Passing on knowledge bought with blood. He wondered if he'd survive to see the end of the war. Wondered if any of them would. Wondered if victory was possible or if they were just prolonging inevitable defeat. But then he remembered. October, they thought Moscow would fall in days. December, they'd push Germans back 100 miles. Impossible had happened. Maybe impossible could happen again. Maybe survival was possible. Maybe victory was achievable. Maybe. That was enough. That was what kept you moving forward. The possibility that maybe things could work out. That maybe sacrifice had meaning. That maybe fighting mattered. Maybe. Anna Volkova would remarry in 1947. A veteran. A man who'd fought at Moscow and Stalingrad and Berlin. A man who understood loss because everyone who'd survived had lost someone. They would raise her children together. Have more children. Build life in aftermath of war that had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. She never forgot her first husband. Never stopped mourning. But she lived, continued. Survived not just war but aftermath. Became grandmother, told grandchildren about November 7th, 1941, the parade in Red Square, standing in the crowd watching soldiers march to their deaths, hearing the leader invoke Russian heroes and wrap communism in something older and deeper. That day, she would tell her grandchildren, I saw a dictator understand his people, didn't forgive him, never forgave him for the terror and the purges and the millions who died because of his mistakes, but understood him. Understood that sometimes leader who creates disasters is same leader who prevents complete catastrophe. Both things true. Both things matter. Dmitry Petrov would rise to deputy minister, would be present at Volkov's death in 1953, would spend retirement writing memoirs that were never published, would die in 1976. His manuscript, The Man Who Stayed Moscow, 1941, would be found by his family decades later. Honest assessment of those months, of the panic and terror and desperate gamble that saved the city. One passage would read, October 16th, I watched Moscow tear itself apart, watched the system that seemed permanent reveal itself as fragile, watched terror maintain order through execution and brutality, understood that everything I'd believed about strength and inevitability was illusion. But I also understood that illusions maintained become reality if enough people believe. Volkov stayed. Projected confidence made people believe survival was possible. And because they believed, they fought. And because they fought, we survived. The illusion became real through collective will. That's how systems work. That's how Moscow held. Mikhail Sokolov would become chief of Soviet military. Would implement victory at Berlin in 1945. Complex relationship with Volkov until the end. Removed from power in 1957, retired. Would give interview in 1960 where he said, October 10th, 1941, I told Volkov truth expecting execution, told him Moscow might fall, told him we were unprepared and exhausted and facing superior enemy, He could have shot me. Instead, he listened, gave me authority, trusted military competence over political considerations. That's why Moscow held. That's why Soviet Union survived. Not because Volkov was genius, because he finally learned that truth matters more than comfortable lies. Leaders who execute messengers of bad news get only good news until disaster arrives. Leaders who listen to truth get chance to respond to reality. That's the difference between surviving and collapsing. Heinrich Weber would survive POW camp, released 1949, would return to West Germany, would become school teacher, would teach history to students who'd grown up during war but didn't remember combat, would tell them, "I saw Kremlin through binoculars, December 1941, 12 miles away, close enough to touch, far enough to be impossible. We'd conquered Poland in weeks, France in months. We thought Russia would be same, but Russia was different. The distance was too great. The cold was too severe. The enemy was too determined. We underestimated all three. Never underestimate enemy's will to survive. Never assume victory because you've won before. Never think distance and weather are minor factors. Those assumptions destroyed us. Remember that." Weber would die in 1978. His letters to Sophie would be published posthumously, including the one written in Chimki on November 28th. "Sophie, I see the Kremlin. Tomorrow we'll be in Red Square. Tomorrow this ends. Tomorrow I come home." The letter that never reached her because he was captured 5 days later. The promise that was never kept. The certainty that was completely wrong. The Soviet Union would win World War II. Cost 27 million dead, more than any other participant. Victory bought with blood and sacrifice and suffering beyond comprehension. Moscow was one battle in that victory. Important battle. Maybe decisive battle, but one among thousands. The question historians would debate for decades: did staying in Moscow save the Soviet Union? Or would the Soviet Union have survived regardless? The answer was unknowable. Counterfactuals don't prove anything, but the logic was this. October 1941, Soviet system was collapsing, government evacuating, military retreating, civilians panicking. The structure of Soviet power held together by projection of inevitable victory and leadership presence was disintegrating. Volkov stayed, projected confidence, held parade while enemy approached, made people believe that survival was possible and victory was inevitable and the system would hold. And because enough people believed, the system did hold. Long enough for Sokolov to organize defense. Long enough for Siberian reinforcements to arrive. Long enough for German offensive to exhaust itself against determined resistance. Causation was complex. Military factors mattered. Weather mattered. German mistakes mattered. Soviet resources mattered. But psychology mattered too. The belief that fighting was worthwhile. That sacrifice had meaning. That the leader who'd created the crisis was also the leader who'd prevent complete catastrophe. That belief came from Volkov staying, from the parade, from the speech invoking Russian heroes and wrapping Soviet cause in something older than communism, from the projection of certainty when everything was uncertain. What Stalin, what Volkov said when Nazis reached the gates of Moscow wasn't militarily significant, didn't change troop dispositions, didn't alter strategic situation, but it changed psychological situation. It told Soviet people and Soviet military that their leader believed in victory. That state was intact. That struggle would continue. The giving up was not an option because the leader who could flee was choosing to stay. In system built on cult of personality, on projection of inevitable triumph, on charisma and terror, and the appearance of invincibility, that mattered. Stalin understood power wasn't just tanks and divisions. It was belief, perception of strength, willingness of millions to keep fighting when situations seemed hopeless. At Moscow, when Germans reached the gates, when city was on verge of panic, when subordinates thought cause was lost, Stalin made the choice that defined his entire approach to power. He stayed. He projected certainty when everything was uncertain. He made theater into weapon. He gambled that what could matter as much as materiel. The Germans could see the Kremlin, could see the golden domes through binoculars, thought victory was within grasp. And Stalin, Standing on that reviewing platform in Red Square while snow fell and soldiers marched past to their deaths, while the enemy prepared to attack, while everything hung in balance told them they were wrong. Moscow would hold, Soviet Union would fight, war would continue. Victory was inevitable because he said it was inevitable, and he stayed to prove he believed it. He was right. The cost was 650,000 to 1 million Soviet casualties. The cost was cities reduced to rubble and villages burned and forests turned into graveyards. The cost was suffering beyond measure. But Moscow held. And in holding Moscow, the Soviet Union survived. Not just survived, proved that Wehrmacht could be defeated, proved that Blitzkrieg could be stopped, proved that will and desperation and refusal to surrender could matter as much as material advantage. That was the foundation. Everything else built on that. 4 more years of brutal warfare, 26 million more Soviet dead. Grinding advance from Moscow to Berlin, suffering and sacrifice and determination that eventually broke the enemy who'd seemed invincible. But it started at Moscow, started with the choice to stay, started with the gamble that confidence could hold systems together, started with the understanding that sometimes symbols matter more than substance, sometimes projection of strength becomes actual strength if enough people believe. The Germans reached the gates of Moscow. They saw the Kremlin. They thought they'd won. They were wrong. Moscow held. The war continued. The impossible became possible. The defeat became victory, because one man stayed when he could have fled, because he projected certainty when everything was uncertain, because he understood that power was as much about belief as capability. History would judge whether that one right decision redeemed 10 wrong ones, whether the sacrifice at Moscow justified the mistakes before Moscow, whether the cost was worth the survival. But the judgment that mattered in December 1941 was simpler. Moscow stood. Soviet Union survived. The fight would continue. That was enough. That had to be enough, because the alternative was unthinkable.